6 minutes after 11, I'm Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh, standing in for Eusebius Makaiza over the next 3 weeks. And we move now to the regular feature, the Literature Corner. And lit is the word because there's been a book that has been setting tongues wagging in our country and starting all kinds of furores and debates. You may have heard about it. It's called the Stellenbosch Mafia. You know, way to make a catchy title. I'm joined by journalist and author of the book, Pieter du Toit. Thanks so much for coming in and joining us on the Literature Corner.
It's a pleasure, Sizwe. Thank you very much for having me.
Before we get into the contents of the book itself, I'm quite interested in your story. You're a prominent journalist in South Africa. What led you to want to write a book like this, which really delves into a network that's prominent in our economy right now?
Well, apart from a very pushy publisher, I suppose. I think
was the title yours or theirs?
It was an easy title to figure out. Look, Sizwe, I think in 2016, 2017, during the Bell Pottinger disinformation campaign, the term Stellenbosch Mafia, along with a couple of other catchphrases, really became very prominent in our political discourse. And the Stellenbosch Mafia was one of those terms. It didn't used to be a phrase or a term with negative connotations. The first time that the phrase or the term Stellenbosch Mafia was used was in the early 2000s, and it was banter between financial journalists, and often was used in financial reporting, referring to Stellenbosch businessmen, specifically Jannie Maton, who was the founder of PSG Investments, and it was an endearing term. It was a humorous term, but in 2016, 2017, it took on a more sinister connotation with the Bell Pottinger campaign, where the Stellenbosch Mafia was cast as the embodiment of everything that was wrong with our economic system, with capitalism, and the individuals that were supposed or purported to be part of that mafia, with Johann Rupert as the head of the mafia, was effectively used to draw away attention from state capture during the height of state capture. So you know, that's where the genesis of the book was, probably around politics, but also, you know, there's a more social, sociological, economic history behind it as well, which I find quite fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's cool about the book and the angle you've taken on the book is that so often the political drama plays out through political protagonists, and you've kind of brought economics, the economy and politics together in this book and found the ways that they interact and intersect.
Well, thanks. It was you know, if as a working journalist, you always wish you have more time to really sink your teeth into the subject. It's an attempt. It's a start at trying to contextualize the town, the individuals, the characters, the businesses in town, because, you know, there are some of the enterprises that are established in town that have headquarters there, or some of the big moguls that make the town their base. It is an interesting and a fascinating story on a purely storytelling level, but, you know, on a more economic, political, and sociological level, I found it fascinating to see where the idea of the Stellenbosch Mafia comes from, and I tried to trace it back to straight after the South African War, actually, you know, through the rise of Afrikaner nationalism, through the height of apartheid, and even post 1994, where a number of them have made enormous contributions to the country and to the economy, and I think that's sometimes a story, not sometimes, it's a story that since the Bell Pottinger campaign has gotten lost. So, you know, you try and tell a nuanced story. It's not the final word, I suppose, but you know, it has led to some debate, which I appreciate.
No, absolutely, and I think that's always the sign of a work that's productive in the discourse. So, okay, there was this concept, the Stellenbosch Mafia. It was raised in different contexts and really reached prominence, as we all remember, kind of in this Bell Pottinger moment. The Stellenbosch Mafia was seen as the kind of like apotheosis of everything that's wrong, the inequality in our society. And then how did you go about trying to tell the story? In the opening of the book, you speak about how you conducted interviews. You actually sometimes spoke directly to the people and the protagonists involved. And you also visited the actual spaces in which this economic network acts. Can you take us through just the journey of writing the book and how you went about telling that story?
So writing a book is much different than writing a news story or an analysis or an opinion piece, which we do on a daily basis as working journalists. It took out quite a lot from me. I mean, it's the news cycle moves so quickly, like you well know. It's difficult to keep touch of what's happening all the time. So to write a book whilst you're doing your day job was a challenge. But the only way that you can do this is to sit down with the main role players and to go and visit Stellenbosch, to spend time there, to try not to immerse yourself, because I know the town very well. I went to school there, studied there as well, so I know the town very well. But that's a different context. So I had to spend time in town, sit across from someone like Rupert. I did visit his house on 2 occasions, spent around 7 hours with him, which was interesting. Which was interesting to see how he carries himself, how he talks to other people, how his thought processes work, and also sit and speak to the other role players as well. So I didn't have access to everyone. I think I spoke to at least the most important of those, representing the old money in Stellenbosch, the old established businesses around the Rupert orbit, and then the new money, businesses and organizations and enterprises that really came into their own after 1994, established after 1994, which makes for an interesting contrast. And then you've got the vulgarity of the very shiny new money of the Steinhoff crowd, which led to some divisions in town. But juxtaposed to this as well, you've got the reality of the enormous economic disparities we still suffer under in this country, which added another layer that you couldn't ignore.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see the way that the book is structured. You start off, as you say, looking at kind of the epicenter of this network, going to visit Rupert. You write quite vividly just about, what it's like, in Somerset West to actually enter, and then, the grounds, the actual room. And,
You've read it, which is it's a good sign.
Well, yeah, my eyes nearly popped out in some instances. And I wanted to ask you, as a journalist, because I'm also interested in this perspective, I actually recently interviewed former President Zuma, and it's just, I think some of the criticisms of the book are that, this is almost an apology. But at the same time, what you do is you get into the minds of some of the people and present that to us in the way that they see themselves, which in some ways does serve the public. It's not everything we want. You weren't sitting there saying, Rupert, you're the evil, Rupert, you're bad. But it's quite a brave decision, because when you do that and you sort of take yourself out of the interview and try to present someone else, sometimes people see it as though you're trying to serve their agenda. How did you deal with those tensions about what the role of an author or a journalist is in trying to present people's views of South Africa and worrying that those views might be taken as your views? Well,
it's a good question. It's certainly something that you can't get away from, and which my editor and I spoke about quite often. The value, I think, and I don't want to trumpet my own book, but I suppose I should.
Here we are.
But the value of the book, I think, lies in trying to visit and see where these people live and operate, and trying to understand how they see the country and society in their own voice. Journalism is an absolutely fascinating profession. I think we're very privileged to be able to do it in this country at this time. But I think sometimes we let our own voices and our own prejudices and our own issues get in the way of just giving an unvarnished, giving readers an unvarnished access to places, people, and events which they normally might not get access to. And this was my main point with the book. I did try to weave in my own judgments or experiences too. But I think the value in something like this is giving a normal reader access to someone and places where they normally would not get access to. So hopefully, you put it out there and people can judge for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's a brave step to take, because the easy thing is, of course, to say, this is terrible, this is unequal, this is all apartheid wealth, look how terrible this is. But in some ways, treating the audience, treating the reader as if they're smart enough to figure this out for themselves is a different less tread path, but one that's quite brave. Like, for example, there are times when you have a quote from your conversation with Rupert where it's just like, what? And I contextualize it for myself. Now, maybe a less mature reader might be like, wow, is this, attempting to put Rupert's perspective across? But in some ways, just the unvarnished views themselves speak for themselves.
Well, exactly. I don't think, if take, for example, the interview that Rupert did with Power FM at the end of last year. You don't need me to tell you that it was an abject disaster. The story tells itself. I try to put that into context of who he is, where how he sees himself in society, in the business world, in politics. Historically, he tried very hard to explain to me that he was a staunch opponent of apartheid. Now, you try to engage him on that, then he pulls back. So you mentioned interviewing President Zuma. Sometimes you interview people and prominent figures who are used not to being challenged. They're used to getting their own way, his way or the highway. And Rupert very much was like that. A fascinating guy to interview, fascinating to sit across and talk about everything from politics to sports to the economy, I thought the value was letting him speak, but yes, to try and contextualize it within where we are as a country now, and where he's come from, where his businesses have come from, how he sees himself, and also the other individuals that I spoke to. So I do try to make conclusions at the end of the book. But I'd love readers rather to read it and say, look, I can understand the guy. I might not agree with him, but I understand him a little bit better.
And just to give some of our listeners some of the context, for example, some really fascinating things that have never been said before that are in this book, with interviews directly with some of the major magnates who reside in Stellenbosch. For example, this is a quote from Johann Rupert. I think we'll be at the IMF in a year's time. The governing party don't know what's awaiting. We'll either have an Arab Spring type event, or Ramaphosa must restructure everything, and he cannot do it. The IMF will, however, force you to restructure. And if you think about it, isn't that the best thing that could ever happen to the country?
And here we are. It's the big debate at the moment. The big debate is, President Ramaphosa, absolutely. What is he doing? He's had 18 months. Increasingly, clamours are, we're hearing more and more people talking about the IMF. There's a lot of discussion, and a lot of people have differing views about that. But what I did find fascinating about that particular conversation where the IMF did crop up was the extent to which and the wide network internationally that he has access to.
That was amazing to me.
It's a lot of it, I suppose, is to try and impress as well. We, at the end of the day, we are humans and we try to impress whomever we talk to. But the fact of the matter is that he is one of the most well-traveled businessmen. He does have access to the top brains in the world, financiers, etc., and that's a reality. And to understand what they think when they talk to him was interesting to hear. Whether we will, of course, go to the IMF is an open question. There's a lot of debate around that, but he has some strong views about what needs to change in the country.
I think one of the other strong views that I was quite alarmed by was this idea that at least the National Party didn't steal. The ANC has stolen from South Africans, and I mean, wow, this kind of corruption only arose yesterday.
Look, of course, he's a creature of his time. He's a creature of a particular period. When you operate and live in the rarefied air that he does, you cannot. I think it's quite impossible to always remain in touch with what's actually happening at grassroots level. If you command a private jet and you fly to Geneva for a board meeting and then get called up by Christine Lagarde for lunch in Paris, then you kind of lose touch. And I think even though I think he's attempted not to do so, that is an unfortunate and a very real function of his life. He came into prominence before apartheid fell. You know, he finished, or he went overseas in the 1970s when the old SAN, or old Defence Force, first engaged Angola in the so-called border war. He told me in an interview as well that the first time that he came across black people was when he only returned from New York. His first contact with black people was actually in New York. And then he tends to say, look, I've got black friends. You can ask Naomi Campbell and Michael Jordan. We're very good friends. It's a very simplistic and naive way of thinking about our country and society and how he engaged with black people. So I think he is removed from our reality. He is removed from the country's political reality to a large extent, even though, as politicians always do, or businessmen always do, they try to influence politicians, and we know how that networks work. But yes, those are one of the comments where you sit back and say, are you serious? You know, you can't. We know you can't compare apartheid with what we've got now. You can't justify now with apartheid. Now, so the era that we're in now, the state capture era is our era. It's not a function of apartheid. So you can't really equate them, I think. And I think that's what he unfortunately tried to do in that case.
And it's a read that has you equal parts fascinated and frustrated, because suddenly you're disagreeing with this view, but then you're also at the same time starting to see things from this perspective as well. You're inside the house, you're inside Rupert's mind, you're inside some of the ways he feels persecuted, and even though you don't want to, you start seeing South Africa from that very different perspective than you've ever seen it before.
One overriding sentiment after doing some of these interviews for me was a sense of disappointment. You know, I really thought that there was more, and there could have been more, not only to our conversations, but to his appraisal of our country. I get that the Bell Pottinger campaign was hugely damaging to a guy like that. I get that it caused personal resentment and all the rest of it. But someone of his stature, someone of his of his experience and influence, his business acumen, the guy can play an enormously positive role in society and in the country, especially given his history. And I think someone like that could take on a very specific and a constructive and a positive role. I was disappointed that he couldn't, for example, handle the Power FM interview in a better way than he did, or after the interview rebounded from that and said, look, what I said, it was unacceptable, I'll take it on the chin, whatever the case may be. The lack of self-reflection, the lack of self-awareness, that was the biggest disappointment for me.
Sure. Okay, I think we've focused on this Rupert conversation, which I think is a really wonderful opening to the book and just a fascinating look into that world. It's also linked to a broader question of Afrikaner nationalism, of Stellenbosch's role in Afrikaner nationalism, and how that history of Afrikaner nationalism has now come to be mirrored through these patterns of economic inequality in our society. Take us through how this book is also a look into the world of Afrikaner nationalism, past and present, through the eyes of some of our biggest billionaires right now.
That certainly, for me personally, was the most fascinating part of the the very light touch research that I did do. Afrikaner nationalism was a product of the South African War, which was a war of exclusion, which was a war between the English colonialists and the Afrikaners upcountry, themselves colonists of an occupied piece of Southern Africa. After the war, there was an enormous sense of loss amongst Afrikaners and there's a difference between Afrikaners in the south of the country and the north of the country. The north of the country is much stronger republicanist sentiments, and the south of the country, in and around Cape Town, Stellenbosch, in that context was a little bit more, not in the present day context, a little bit more progressive, a little bit more liberal.
Sure.
But after the Anglo-Boer War, the South African War, Afrikaners in the north had no way to express their nationalism or their pride in culture, or whatever you want to call it. And Stellenbosch became the cradle of that. Stellenbosch became a town where, especially in the first 2 decades after the South African War, you had some of the biggest Afrikaner companies being established, including Nationalism, that's now Naspers, Sanlam, the big insurer, and a number of other companies were established there with capital raised from among Afrikaners. The University of Stellenbosch, for example, was a feat in resistance in itself. The then colonial government thought that only one university in the southern part of the country was needed. That would be the University of Cape Town, unless the people of Stellenbosch could raise £100,000, which in 1909 or 10 I think was quite a steep amount. That amount was financed by an Afrikaner industrialist that came from Kimberley that made his money on at the diamond field. So that's where it all started. And then the university was established, and apartheid, separate development, segregation, those types of ideologies found a home in Stellenbosch. It was thought up by academics in Stellenbosch. Chief amongst them, obviously, Hendrik Verwoerd, who was a sociologist at the Department of Sociology. So Stellenbosch has not only a political and a cultural role to play, or a cultural plank on which Afrikaner nationalism was built, but on the business side as well. That's where the biggest Afrikaner businesses were established, and out of that flowed Anton Rupert, who was a product of Afrikaner nationalism. After, tell me when I'm boring you, but after the National Party took over in 1948, there was still enormous resentment towards English-speaking South Africans and Jewish South Africans, because they dominated the business environment. Not to speak of black people who were totally excluded.
Sure.
And Anton Rupert was a project of Afrikaner nationalism. He was put forward by the growing tide of nationalism. He went into business with, or he was brought up to go into business by a number of political figures, like former heads of state and prime ministers, who said, let's identify someone to push forward to compete in the business world, to show that Afrikaners can compete in the business world. And from that flowed the Rembrandt Empire, Remgro, and you've got Johann Rupert today. So it's a long umbilical cord, but it stretches back to the early part of the previous century.
What was really fascinating to me, and we'll get to the start of this before we go to the headlines at past, but I'd like to continue it after that, is how political influence, especially from that period. I learned from your book actually that Anton Rupert's father was actually central in the National Party. And that there were a lot of the political influence that was brought to the fore under apartheid has now evolved into this tremendous economic influence. And if you trace it back down family lines, you can actually see a lot of links back to the apartheid political establishment.
Absolutely. Anton Rupert, as I said, was a project of Afrikaner nationalism. They wanted to show that Afrikaners could also compete on equal footing with English-speaking and especially Jewish-speaking businessmen. And he got a leg up from a number of Afrikaner organizations and co-ops and banks who said, we need to get one of our own in there. What's fascinating that I found, and there's an interesting exhibition at the Constitutional Court, at the Women's Jail actually, about how Afrikaners initially weren't quite very interested in the capitalist project. They were much more amenable to a sort of a collectivist, socialist, communist environment. And when the Communist Party of SA, the precursor to the SACP, was established, they saw the Afrikaners as a big market for them, because Afrikaners didn't trust banks. They put money underneath their cushions when they went to go and sleep, pillows when they went to go and sleep at night. So they didn't trust the capitalist environment. But with the attainment of political power, that changed.
Absolutely. Well, we're in conversation with Pieter du Toit, who has written a really, really interesting book called The Stellenbosch Mafia. You may have seen people speaking about it, and it's definitely set tongues wagging. And, we've been speaking about some of the ways he came to write the book, the way that the book is structured. We've been speaking about the opening of the book, which focuses on the person of Johann Rupert, and tracing some of the links back to Anton Rupert. And now, after this, we're going to speak about some of the later chapters in the book and how it evolves from there. First, though, we're going to go to the headlines, and we'll be back straight after this. Welcome back to the Literature Corner, 25 minutes to 12, and I'm in conversation with Pieter du Toit, who's written The Stellenbosch Mafia. We're talking about the book. We've spoken a little bit about the motivations for the book and the way the book opens. And this book is fascinating for tracing the different relationships which happen in Stellenbosch, trying to separate myth from reality in terms of this concept, the Stellenbosch Mafia, that has been thrown around so much in our politics. We spoke a little bit about the Rupert dynasty and the way that that has worked. There's a really interesting interview, basically a long-form interview with Rupert that opens up in the beginning of the book. But there are so many different characters here, and I think what's useful is, the Stellenbosch Mafia is this vague term. It's like, who are the people who are in Stellenbosch? What businesses are actually owned? And how does this network work? Is it even coordinated? And so, from Jannie Mouton to Edwin Herzog, there are lots of different characters that to which you refer, all the way to Marcus Jooste and, just G.T. Ferreira. So there are all these different characters, and I wanted to move on to now to some of the middle chapters where you draw the links between all these different players and how they came to Stellenbosch, the old ones, the new ones, and how these networks kind of intersect.
So the networks are fascinating, and the one thing that I think, what I try to tell people as well is that society and individuals, where every one of us, we're part of a network, whether it is a school network, a university network, a network at work, at church, or whatever the case may be. This network is different, but it's a network, and the networks in Stellenbosch emanate from the schools, emanate from the university and residences at the university, and then the networks emanate from the different businesses that are established in town. Now, the biggest and the strongest one of these networks are the ones that emanate from Remgro, the old money in Stellenbosch, the Rupert money. And then you've got the new networks, new money, businesses that are new arrivals in town, and a number of them established after 1994. And I'm immediately thinking about Capitec, for example, which is one of our big success stories in the banking sector, which also actually the leadership there, every one of them, in one way or another, in their professional history, was involved with the Rupert Empire as well. So you've got Mediclinic, you've got Capitec, you've got PSG, which is the big investment house, which was established by Jannie Mouton in the middle to late 1990s.
Fascinating character.
And they moved down to Stellenbosch for various reasons, and now call Stellenbosch their base. So, but if you, for example, look at networks that emanate from the University of Witwatersrand, University of Cape Town, the networks in the northern parts of Johannesburg. You can even go to the gangster networks in Bedford-View that my colleague Manny Wiener often writes about. Networks are exactly that. It's people who use their expertise and influence to the advantage of themselves and the people in their networks. This network specifically revolves around business and the economy and wealth and investment. But the one thing that I can say, much to the irritation of the critics of the book, is that everyone that I spoke to in this book are committed to the country. They don't believe that apart from Rupert, no one said they want to leave the country or they disappointed in the democratic project. All of them are invested in the country and invested in the country's success, which I found gratifying, but also they've got a lot of interest here, so it would be anti their interest if the country failed. And
I think one of the tasks of the book is to kind of separate myth from reality, and you do debunk this myth that there's this kind of cigar smoke filled room where on a weekly basis the Stellenbosch Mafia sits to decide exactly what's going to happen in South African politics. What was that like, just also realizing that a lot of these people are also self-conscious about the narrative, and they make jokes about, we're part of the mafia, ha ha ha, and the fact that this myth has has actually reached them, and they are self-consciously trying to react to it in their different ways.
So two things, Sizwe. The first is, I think, debunking myths, yes, but also to get this on the record. Get it on the record. It's on paper. It's on the shelves. The interviews that I conducted was on the record, and this is their true feeling. So put it to them, and this is, we might differ with them, but this is how they see it. They did make jokes about it 10 years ago, but the joke's done. They don't laugh about it anymore. They are deeply concerned about the myth making that you referred to, about demonizing people, individuals, companies. The economy, for example, is a contested space. So they feel alienated as representatives of high finance, high capital. They do feel alienated from the system because of the political attacks on them. And I found it interesting to engage with them on that very question. So there was an acknowledgement, certainly from someone like Edwin Herzog, who's the chairperson of MediClinic, that we and I'm speaking on, I'm paraphrasing here. Yeah. He said that we as a company, we want to make a contribution to society, but it's difficult to do it in this political environment where A, we are being demonized, and B, it's difficult to work with government in the private healthcare sector. I did put the question to Herzog, for example, but you can understand criticism from a society as divided and as unequal as ours, that there's a company making billions of rands off private healthcare, and that's a very nuanced and interesting debate as well. But he was willing to engage me on that debate, which was good to hear and good to see. So they don't laugh about the epithet of Stellenbosch Mafia anymore. They feel threatened. They feel politically threatened. They feel it's unfair.
And I think part of what's maybe misleading about that narrative is how simplistic it is. This is not to say that billionaires in Stellenbosch don't control a lot. I mean,
no, they do.
One thing that your book shows is just how deep these networks go into every facet of our lives and our economy. But the economy is deeper than just this one network. There's so many different networks that come into being, be them in Joburg, be them in Cape Town, be them in different parts of the country. And we need to understand the full picture as opposed to just reducing it to this one network,
and individuals as well.
Sure.
It was. I think the Bell Pottinger campaign was very successful in targeting individuals and placing creating and establishing individuals as the personification of one or other ill, when it's much deeper and much more complex than that. The economic issues that we have in this country is a function of our history, and we can't argue with that. The changes that needs to be made to try and rectify and try and change those historical patterns, for example, runs quite contrary to the governing party's ideologies. So there's a larger debate that we're going to have, and Kobisi Jonas, with the launch of his new book, has asked that we, South Africans need to engage with this in an adult way as well. Stop screaming from the periphery. Stop hurling insults. Let's rather engage with the actual issues at hand. And if there are people who declare that they want to make a contribution, as all of these members of the so-called mafia did, let's rather use the intellectual capital and willingness of everyone to try and change things, because I think we're at a point where we're going to have to make drastic changes in this country if we're going to survive and succeed. And from someone like Maton, who built PSG, or the crowd at Capitec, who built a very accessible and very sexy bank as well, there's stuff to learn. And if they're willing to share their knowledge with whomever wants it, I think we should exploit that. We spoke about, and we finished the Rupert interview or the Rupert segment, but after the Power FM interview, there were about 300 or 400 people at that event hosted by Power FM. And even though Rupert made the comments that really riled up a lot of people, that a lot of it was unacceptable in the time that we're in, people stood in a queue to try and get his number or get access to him or ask him advice. And that tells you something about the frustrations that a lot of South Africans has with the economy and how the economy is structured and how to create wealth and how you should create wealth. And, must we create wealth? So it's all these questions that I think that we need to debate rather than whole insults and make it about individuals and personalities.
Absolutely. We're in conversation with the author of the Stellenbosch Mafia, Pieter du Toit, and we will be back after this short break. It is about 11:45, just gone, and we're in conversation with Pieter du Toit, who is the author of the Stellenbosch Mafia. We've been talking about this book that has been setting many conversations going and really focusing on the Stellenbosch Mafia, the concept, whether it's useful, whether it's not, who are the people that are in Stellenbosch right now, how much influence do they wield. And Pieter, we have moved from the beginning to the middle, looking at a lot of the different players in this game. But then you have this end section, which comes to all of the Steinhoff saga, but from a really different angle, from inside Stellenbosch, and how the old money is seeing this new, much more flamboyant style coming into Stellenbosch, and just all the interactions that happened there. What was that section writing like? And tell us some of the stories that you saw about people not always being at one with each other inside Stellenbosch.
No, the one thing that I think disappoints many people about the book is that there isn't a smoke-filled room where people come together and play the president as a puppet master. That's not how it works. And also, there's a myth that everyone gets along. They don't. Rupert doesn't like this guy. This guy doesn't like Christo Wiese. Christo Wiese doesn't like that guy. No one likes Marcus Jooste. So it was interesting to see that dynamics as well, but also it was fascinating, and again, I'm not a psychologist, but to see how all of them, most of them, crave acceptance by another group or another individual or the town itself. Marcus Jooste was an interesting example. He desperately wanted to be part of the mafia. He desperately wanted to be referred to in the same vein or in the same breath as someone like Rupert. So he rocked up in town with Steinhoff. They built this massive headquarters right next to Remgro, which is where the Rupert Empire is the seat of the Rupert Empire is. And then he proceeded to try and muscle his way into society. And in Stellenbosch, one of the ways that you do that is through the rugby club, which is such a big part of Afrikaner culture in town. And he proceeded to sponsor the rugby club, much to the irritation of the old money in town. So there was this dynamic where people wanted to flaunt their wealth. They want to be part of the set, the it set, and they pursued a number of ways to try and get into that crowd. What irritated the old money, represented by the Rupert Remgro Empire, was the way in which Steinhoff came into town with their smart cars, Ferraris. They had expensive and raucous parties. Mid-level managers' wives were driven around by chauffeurs. They started sponsoring the rugby club, like I mentioned. They sponsored the South African Sevens rugby team. So they flaunted their wealth. Suddenly you saw the appearance of Maybach 1s and Maybach 2s in town. Cars that, even though, my mother-in-law always says that, old money doesn't shimmer, and new money does. And in this case, the new money really did shimmer. So the Ferraris, the Perspex garage doors in some of the most expensive parts of town, so people can see the cars when they walk or drive past. That was vulgar, and it certainly drove a wedge between the old money and the new money. When Steinhoff went down, a lot of Schadenfreude in that town, and still it's a very big talking point in town.
And just like when you sit back and you look at how flamboyant things started to become in the Steinhoff era at its peak, and you reflect just on the broader inequalities in our society, just those passages where you're talking about like Ferraris just driving past people literally not only holding this wealth, but crassly displaying it and almost shoving it in people's faces. Like Kaya Mandi's just around the corner often.
Exactly.
And the bubble is so intense that people are more concerned with these rivalries than the broader social questions.
So the thing, and I have to declare my interest here as well. I went to school and studied there, and I love going back there. My friend, a lot of my friends still stay there. I'm going back over the weekend, incidentally. But
Ferrari or none?
Kalula. But what frustrates me enormously, and they talk about the bubble, and they try to isolate themselves actively from the rest of the country. And we know very well from living in this city, in the time that we are, that you cannot isolate yourself as a community, whether it is a language group, a cultural group, or whatever it is. Our future is intrinsically linked to each other. Stellenbosch is part of the country. Stellenbosch is not Stellenbosch, but I think they've become so so enamored with themselves, the town. It exists for Stellenbosch's sake. And I think that is why the town seems to be isolated. I think that the geography plays a role as well. It's ensconced between these mountains, which kind of cuts it off from the rest of the Western Cape as well. And the people often there, they're very chuffed with themselves. And the inequalities that we see in this country, you see it play out in Stellenbosch as well. One of the most grotesque stories that I retell in the book is of a specific billionaire whose son wanted a big Mercedes truck, a 6-wheeler truck. I forget the model's make now, but you can Google it. And Mercedes-Benz said that they don't produce right-hand drives in the country. You need to import it. He promptly called up the CEO of Mercedes-Benz in Germany and said, I want one of these for my son. The guy said, we only export them in units of 10. He said, well, I'll take 10 and I'll dispose of them here. And they were exported here, and he gave some of them away, gave one to another billionaire as a gift. But on the driver's seat, there was an invoice for the import tax. And it was promptly returned to that businessman saying, if you're going to give me a gift, I'm not going to pay the import tax. But, it's a grotesque way of flaunting your enormous wealth when you still have the slum that is Kayamandi just outside of town.
Yeah.
Not to say that a lot of them don't do good work, and that also is a fact.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a really...
It's
jarring.
It's complicated.
Yeah, no, it is. It is, but it's a jarring insight as well, because as you're reading these stories, you're getting... You yourself go into the bubble and you start to think, am I a Visa person or am I a Euster person? Am I old money? Am I new? But then,
yeah, exactly.
But then suddenly you're like, whoa, like, how is this happening in South Africa?
I think and that's the big debate about inequality in this country, and what we don't want an Arab Spring event like Rupert warns us about, but we're headed that way if we don't make significant and very big changes into the structure of society. It cannot be that some people earn literally billions of rands every year, whilst other people go hungry. Now, that is a nuanced discussion as well, because the state in many instances has failed to provide services which they're supposed to do under law and under the Constitution. We're a middle income country, but we do have enough money to make sure that everyone gets adequate medical care, everyone gets a proper matric, and that everyone at least doesn't go to bed hungry at night. That's a bare minimum, and we know that there's enough money in the country to do that. It's about ensuring that we cater for everyone.
What did kind of also shock me a bit was there wasn't a great deal, I felt, of reflexivity of just even the symbolism of within the people that you interviewed. Like, these are all relatively elderly or middle-aged to elderly white men in South Africa. Afrikaans, white men in South Africa, going back to apartheid's epicenter and like building this bubble. And nobody seems to realize that, like, people see this and the symbolism of that act is bound to cause some resentment.
Absolutely. And again, self-reflection, self-awareness is so important. But that means you need to get out of the bubble sometimes. No one resents someone. I don't think people resent other people living a good life. But if you're a little bit more self-aware, a little bit more involved in broader society, then you're going to be safe. Then you're going to lead a much fuller and more fulfilled life, I would argue. Not saying that some of them don't, but a lot of the people in Stellenbosch, and I'm not talking about the so-called members of the mafia, because I do think they get out a little bit more. But
sure.
the second tier of millionaires, the people who don't set foot in Bellville or Somerset West or Worcester to the north, there's a lot of them. They when they leave Stellenbosch, it's to go to Europe and they rush back. And I think there needs to be Stellenbosch as a town, but all of us, every South African, I think we all need to reach out a little bit more to communities that look different to you, speak different to you, and find themselves in a different socioeconomic space than you. That's the only way that we're going to create better cohesion.
Just finally, I think your book comes not only at an opportune time because of the Stellenbosch Mafia question, but there are all these questions about private influence over our political system and funding. And reading your book and reading in between the lines of your book, it does seem to me that although the smoke-filled room myth gets debunked, there's definitely some interaction between the political system, between senior political leaders, maybe even across all parties, and this very influential group of business people in Stellenbosch.
Absolutely. Look, there's no doubt that businessmen who live in Stellenbosch, the so-called members of the Stellenbosch Mafia, do interact with politicians, and I write about it in my book. But that's the way of the world. That's how political systems work. We've seen how it could be abused. You know, the last decade has been a case in point. These people obviously have vested interests in the country. They want to know what's going to happen on the political front. They want to influence it as much as they can. The problem is that where we are now is that these interactions aren't regulated. We don't know of many of them. We don't know what happens behind the scenes. That's why we need to interrogate it on all fronts. Whether it be the Ramaphosa campaign, for example, or the Dlamini Zuma campaign, we need to ask these people, what do you want in return? Because that's always the question, you know. I do think that from my interactions with them, there is, especially after the last decade, serious cause of, they're very concerned about the country's future. But then, I would argue if you donated money, for example, to the Ramaphosa campaign, come out and own it and say, this is why I did it. Because it is going to come out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Pieter du Toit, the author of The Stellenbosch Mafia, thank you so much for joining us and wishing you all the best with the book.
Thank you very much, Sizwe. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
That was author Pieter and journalist Pieter du Toit, who's written The Stellenbosch Mafia. Make sure you catch the podcast. Make sure that you watch the YouTube video on my YouTube channel. And let's make sure we continue this discussion on social media as well afterwards. Hope you've been enjoying it. Ayeye. Thanks for watching the content. Like, share, and subscribe on all platforms. smwx.co.za to join the WhatsApp channel. And let's build a new conversation for a new generation. Ayeye.